So in Harry Harlow, we met a response, a scientific response, a social psychological response to the collective problem of the changes in population and the loss of built-in family knowledge of how to rear kids. The next case, Stanley Milgram, is also specific to a time and place, though the place is more global now. The time is 1961. These experiments were conducted in Yale University in America. But the problem they were addressing was not as local. It was a global problem, and the problem was evil. It's a long time since the Second World War now. It's impossible to realize what the horror was that was revealed in 1945 when Allied troops came upon the death camps of Auschwitz and other places, found out all about the Holocaust. This was a shock to humanity. It was also a problem. The problem was what to do with Germany, where it seemed like an entire nation had gone insane, absolutely bad. One of the first things that happened was the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 46, where a bunch of senior Nazi officers were put on trial and then by and large executed. And the response of the Allies here was to focus on the top 1% or so of Nazis, and by and large to turn a blind eye to the collaboration of the majority of the German population in order to get Germany back on its feet as a nation again. There were more trials, though. In 1961, Eichmann was tried. He was one of the architects of the Holocaust. He had been caught in Argentina, and he was kidnapped and brought to Jerusalem, where he was put on trial, and this trial was watched by the whole world. Now, the question everyone was asking at these trials, both the Nuremberg and the Eichmann trial, was how could this happen? How could people go so bad? The defendants kept saying they were just following orders. Is that plausible? There was genuine horror and fear. And that was the theme that Milgram set out to explore. So certainly not a light theme. In the Milgram experiments, there was advertisements placed in the local paper, shown here, persons needed for a study of memory, and the advertisement made it clear that they wanted people to come and be subjects in the experiment who were unfamiliar with the university environment. They were specifically going after working class people, people who had not been to university, and they were asked to come and take part in a study of memory at a prestigious university. Yale University is one of the Ivy League universities. And when people from here turn up, they turn up and are greeted by a scientist with a white coat. We scientists like to have white coats, gives us a kind of authority. And then they were told that they were being randomly assigned to one of two roles. They were either going to be the learner or the teacher. In the experimental setup, the scientist is the experimenter shown here with E. The teacher is always the subject who has come in. There's no randomization. They were told it was random whether they were teacher or learner, but they were always the teacher. The learner was a paid actor, a stooge, if you like. The subject, who is now the teacher, sits in the same room as the experimenter and watches the learner, who is in a different room, watches them through a one-way mirror. The learner seems to be hooked up to an electrical device that administers shocks, and the job of the teacher is every time that the learner gets a question wrong from the experimenter, the teacher has to push a button and cause an electric shock. Here's the device for the electric shocks, and you can see a row of buttons that go from 15 volts all the way up to something quite horrendous. As the learner gets questions wrong, the amount of the voltage administered gets greater. So you start at 15 volts, but if you go all the way up to the end, you're administering 450 volts, which is extremely dangerous, life-threatening. And there was a script. Now, no electric shocks are actually being given. The learner is an actor, and there's a script that they're following. But the person administering the shocks, who thinks they're administering the shocks, does not know this. In the script, at 120 volts, the learner shouts in pain. At 150 volts, the learner asks to stop. Please stop. At 300 volts, they start pounding on the wall. If we ever get there at 330 volts, they just stop responding. And the series goes all the way up to 450 volts. And the question that has been asked in this experiment is, how far will teachers, those are the people who've been brought in, how far will they go? I hope you can see this is relevant to the question of, if I give you orders to do something that's obviously evil, will you still do it? Here, the authority is the authority of the scientist in a respectable university. The person taking part in the experiment is being brutally tortured. This is a horrible experiment to take part in. People were not happy. Many were reduced to tears. But the question is, how far would they go? They predicted, because there's always some psychopaths, that maybe 2% of the people who took part in this would go all the way to 430 volts. 65% went to the maximum level. This is utterly terrifying. That is, the subjects were manipulated and were, from their point of view, they were brought to deliver electric shocks to the point of making someone unconscious by virtue of being told to do so by the experimenter. Now, it's easy to draw facile, simplistic conclusions from this. In fact, the details of power, the details of authority, the role of the university, the white coat, the scientist, all play a role, and it's not easy to generalize to them to the problem of Nazi Germany. But you can see how this work is responding to some real collective fears. Here's a little shot of one of the participants who took part in the experiment.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experiment, that's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it now. I'm not gonna kill that man in there. I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
375 volts. I think something's happened to that fellow in there. I don't get no answer. He was hollering a less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
Milgram's findings horrified America. They showed that decent American citizens were as capable of committing acts against their conscience as the Germans had been under the Nazis.
You get a sense of how terrible it was to take part in this experiment here. So you can see again that the Milgram experiments, while it's very difficult to draw conclusions, that they are prompted and motivated by genuine fears. Milgram was also a very serious psychologist. The next case study is probably the most famous social psychology experiment of all time. It's probably some of the worst science ever done. It's known as the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was not an experiment. It's not conducted in accordance with any scientific norms. But again, we have to understand where it comes from, what's the time and the context in which it plays out. And this now takes us up to about 1971. And around this time, what's going on in America? We've got the civil rights movement, which is leading to huge protest marches and violent confrontations with an increasingly militarized police. There's violence everywhere. There's also TVs in every house by now. We're up to the 1970s, so people's TV screens, which show the news every evening, are filled with scenes like these. As well as the civil rights movement, we've got the Vietnam War going on, and there's huge anti-war protests, again frequently met with violence on the part of the authorities. Much like the Black Lives Matter summer, There's every evening there's new riots, and people are terrified by this. And they need to understand the role of the police in this, the role of authority in bossing people around. And that's the sort of background against which Philip Zimbardo in Stanford University designed what he called the Stanford Prison Experiment. What he did was he turned the basement of the department into a mock prison. Volunteers to this experiment were this time actually randomly assigned one of two roles, that of guard or that of prisoner. And the plan was that they would be treated as if they were in a prison for 14 days in order to study the behavior of the guards and the behavior of the prisoners. Now, this was never set up as a scientific experiment. Zimbardo took part in it, egged on the guards. He clearly wanted to elicit a certain kind of authoritarian behavior on the part of the guards. He encouraged them in abusing the prisoners. It all went terribly, terribly wrong. After 6 days, after a visit by his girlfriend and later wife, the whole thing was called off. There was never an experiment here with control conditions and data capture. There were no results that were ever published in a scientific journal. Nonetheless, it generated a huge amount of publicity, and it's only really in the last 10 years or so that people have really been vocal about saying this was narcissistic nonsense. It was a piece of performance art on the part of Philip Zimbardo. We understand where it's coming from given the context of the violent protests in America at the time, but this is totally misconceived and really served only as a platform for projection of Philip Zimbardo, the terribly important scientist. Philip Zimbardo, after this, went on to become president of the American Psychological Association, which inspires zero confidence in that particular organization. One of the required readings for this is an I am a thread on Reddit by one of the guards who took part in the Stanford Prison Experiment. And if you want to understand it, it's very important to read that because most of the material that's out there has been curated and promoted by Philip Zimbardo himself. It's his narcissistic project. This is what makes him feel important. As a non-scientific intervention, it was a disaster from start to finish. There was no scientific rigor in it, no scientific results emerged, but the story got out and became one of those popular myths, as if there had been an experiment, as if we had found out that wearing glasses and having specific roles in an institution causes you to behave in a particular way. Here's that social determinism fear coming in once again. But such nonsense has real-world consequences. During the first Iraq War, the US, when they took out Saddam Hussein, they also took over a prison outside Baghdad called Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib was a prison in which Saddam Hussein had routinely tortured and murdered prisoners. And when the Americans took it over, they too tortured and murdered prisoners in there. Some photographs got out about this. There's a rather iconic one of someone being told that they have to stand like this or they get electric shocks again. There were dogs used, people were beaten and indeed murdered. Why do I mention this? Well, when the scandal broke, there was questions of who's responsible, of course. And there was trials. Some of the officers, including this guy here you see, were put on trial. Expert witnesses were called, one of whom was Philip Zimbardo. Because of the Stanford Prison Experiment, he was held to be an authority on the role of institutional roles in promoting violence and bad behavior. This proved to be very lucky for those higher up in the chain of command, all the way up to Donald Rumsfeld, because it protected anybody above the guards being held responsible. In other words, the Stanford Prison Experiment was misused in order to provide political cover by posing again as a scientific experiment. So, social psychology has this weird character. First of all, we're always going to look for help when new stuff happens. When a virus breaks out and we've got questions about Zoom time and masks and singing and so on, we need to ask, and social psychologists will step up and respond. But psychology is extremely limited in its ability to tell us about our social organization, our collective attitudes. This is where we have most work to do, especially at a time where war continues, climate change is coming, there's all kinds of evidence of major serious social change going on. We find ourselves in a difficult position where new ways of understanding our collective nature are absolutely necessary if anyone is to survive.